Take a seat.
As I said with regard to China, the United States has been very ambivalent. A lot of engagement of China economically, huge trade between the two places. The U.S. is now increasingly dependent on China to support American debt, but there is also simultaneously an effort to hedge against the modernization or the expansion of the current Chinese military, and the United States has been pushing missile defense in conjunction with Japan, the allegation being, or the claim being, that this is directed against rogue regimes like North Korea, but many in China's military are quite convinced that they will be at least as subject to the effectiveness of the missile defense as anything in North Korea. And so there's this very ambivalent position, it seems to me, with the U.S. in regard to China. I mentioned the trade. These are just some numbers that support it. But the U.S. debt, as it has increased, has given China a much greater lever over the United States. China now holds a huge portion of the current American debt. And this basically goes back to the Pentagon. The Pentagon's starting position is that it will allow no peer competitor in Asia. That is to say, America's military force must be far and away preeminent in Asia, and moves by any country such as China to close that gap will be immediately resisted. So the U.S. is split between its economic wings and its military wings as to how to think about China. Within ASEAN, as I said, I think the U.S. has marginalized ASEAN, not taken it terribly seriously. Condi Rice skipped the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting in 2005. A number of other top leaders took her lead and bailed out or left early. She was chastened and returned in 2006 to the meeting, but then in 2007 she skipped it again. George Bush postponed the 30th anniversary celebrations of the U.S.-ASEAN partnership. And meanwhile, I think ASEAN can be said to have moved much closer to China as a result of the free trade pact that China has put in place with ASEAN, and particularly as a result of China's openness to agricultural exports from the ASEAN countries through this program called Early Harvest. And let me turn last to North Korea and the Bush administration on North Korea. Cynics would say that the United States under Bush began with an ABC policy, anything but Clinton. If Clinton had done it, we're going to do the opposite. And this was certainly true with regard to North Korea. Colin Powell was briefed during the transition period. Well, not everybody's as familiar with the details. I'll back up just one step. You may recall that at the end of 2000, up to and right after the election of 2000, George Bush and Secretary of State Albright were in close negotiations with North Korea. Madeleine Albright had gone to North Korea as a way to lay the groundwork for a possible normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and North Korea. Some real progress had been made. There were problems, no question about it, but there was clearly a move in the direction of progress. It was even bandied about that Bill Clinton might make a trip to North Korea. Once the Supreme Court decided the election in favor of Bush, it was clear that, and the Bush people made it clear that they would not go along with this. The chances of Clinton going to North Korea backed off very quickly. But the negotiators with North Korea briefed Colin Powell, the incoming Secretary of State, on the negotiations and how things stood. Colin Powell, just prior to a visit by Kim Dae-jung to the United States, announced that U.S. policies toward North Korea would in many ways continue from where the Clinton administration had left off. Once his claims or comments hit the press, he was immediately taken to the woodshed by the leaders of the Bush administration, probably Dick Cheney, but George Bush nominally, and told that that was not going to be the forthcoming policy. And Colin Powell made the now famous comment that he had gotten a little far ahead on his skis with regard to North Korea policy, and that there would be a complete review of North Korean policy. George Bush was quoted as having made a complimentary phone call or taking a congratulatory and introductory phone call by Kim Dae-jung, and he'd been briefed on Kim's efforts. And apparently, as Kim was saying, we've got to negotiate with North Korea, Bush put his hand over the phone and said, "Who is this guy? He doesn't know anything about foreign relations at all. He's the most naive guy I've ever talked to." So clearly, Bush began with a very different view of North Korea than his predecessor had done. A very hard line taken with the so-called axis of evil speech, lots of comments about the need for regime change in North Korea. During the October visit by Jim Kelly, October 2002 visit of Jim Kelly, the United States claimed that North Korea was putting in place a highly enriched uranium program, which, if true, would have been a violation of the existing accords. North Korea had stopped its plutonium provision, and that was subject to IAEA inspection, but there are two ways, at least, to make nuclear weapons. There may be more than that. If there are any experts in the field, the two I know about are plutonium and HEU. North Korea had clearly brought in centrifuges from Kuan's Pakistani network. Whether that was enough to actually have an HEU program or not is still subject to a great deal of debate. European allies who have been shown the evidence seem to think that nothing serious was going on. But regardless of that, 2002, things really began to deteriorate. Once the six-party talks began, many in the diplomatic field said the United States should follow a carrots-and-stick approach. The South Koreans were pushing for carrots to reward the North Koreans for doing positive things. And John Bolton, who was very much a player in this, said that, "I don't do carrots." That was his famous quote. That is to say, it's going to be all sticks. Dick Cheney said, "We don't negotiate with evil, we destroy it." Bush was quoted on numerous occasions as talking about Kim Jong-il as a pygmy, as an evil man, et cetera, et cetera. Rice talked about North Korea as an outpost of evil. So there was this incredible verbiage that was going on, which was hardly conducive to diplomacy. Eventually, and it's a long story, and I'm happy to get into it in the Q&A, but I want to get through the rest of the broader story. The United States finally softened some of its positions, but only after a series of missile launches by North Korea in 2006, subsequently in October, nuclear test that essentially made North Korea clearly a nuclear power. And not coincidentally, I think, because I think domestic politics plays a big role in what the Bush administration was doing or not doing, the Democrats won control of both houses of Congress in 2006, November of 2006. So starting in January of 2007, the U.S. Suddenly began to negotiate with North Korea on a bilateral basis under the six-party talks, something it had refused to do prior to that. And we've seen some real moves forward in the six-party talks since then. There's an interesting secondary set of issues here as the U.S. has been pushing Japan to move further to the right or take on a more conservative tack. Japan and China have fallen into very different positions within the six-party talks, and Japan is now the furthest to the right, demanding a full accounting of the abductees taken by North Korea from Japan during the 1970s and 80s, and resisting any efforts to encourage Japan to provide economic assistance to the North, etc. So there's been a real change in those policies. Summary statement is that while many would say, and many Bush defenders would say, America's relations with Asia are in pretty good shape, I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that in lots of places there are some very serious problems, most of which trace back to the excessive militarization of American foreign policy. The second big thread I want to take up, and I'm going to be a little bit more brief with this, although I probably should spend more time on this since this is a public policy school and you guys are probably all steeped in economic theory and would love to talk about this ad nauseum. But suffice to say that I think the Bush administration's fiscal policies have demonstrated a certain level of economic mismanagement. Fiscal and monetary policies, I think, have been more or less a disaster. The Clinton administration left a surplus in the budget of $236 billion. It was projected that if no changes were made in the basic structure of the American budget and the taxes that continued, that by the end of 10 years there would be a surplus of about $5.6 trillion. George Bush came into power saying $236 billion, that's a lot of money. That is your money. I'm going to give it back to you in the form of a tax cut. The tax cut, of course, had a very particular bias to it. Most of the tax cuts went to the Republican base, very minimalist reduction in taxes for anything that might remotely approach the middle class or below. The use of economic advisors was a very small part of the Bush team. You may recall that Secretary of the Treasury Paul O'Neill was essentially fired when he challenged the support for agribusiness and when he challenged the need for the tax cut policies. Larry Lindsey, the major economic advisor, was fired when, among other things, he suggested that the war in Iraq might actually cost as much as a couple of $1 billion. We're now approaching a couple of $1 trillion. Lindsey was off, but in the wrong direction. He was accused of having overstated the cost of the war. And basically, Dick Cheney, took the position that the tax cuts were essentially a part of the Bush administration's economic policy. As he claimed, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. We won the elections. This is our due. In other words, we will reward our supporters. The tax cuts are a critical part of what we ran on, and we are going to deliver on those. But of course, in addition to the tax cuts, the U.S. faced an increasing problem with the rising costs, the rapidly rising costs of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. The latest hard numbers I had were that the war combined was costing $750 billion. It's costing about $10 billion a month. There are now books out talking about the possibility that the combined wars will actually cost much more like $3 trillion. Probably none of us in this room can even envision what those numbers really mean. Suffice it to say that it's created a mammoth gap between the taxes coming in on the one hand and the expenditures going out on the other. And the end result of that is that the United States has moved rapidly into debt. The federal government debt has nearly doubled from $5.6 trillion to over $9.5 trillion just since 9/11 and 2008. Roughly a third of the current U.S. federal deficit has been created since George Bush came into office. And in one of those quotes that I think is more telling about the philosophy than anything else, George Bush once said, actually he said more than once, I was campaigning, he said, in this case he said I was campaigning in Chicago, and somebody asked me, is there ever any time when the budget might go into deficit? And he said, I said it would only be if we were at war or had a national emergency or we were in a recession. And little did I know that I'd hit the trifecta. That is to say, the U.S. is at war, there's a national emergency, and we're in a recession. So every good reason to be running a deficit. Lots of numbers on the debt, but the point that I think is most important for thinking about Asia is the fact that roughly half of America's current debt is held by foreigners, and the bulk of that is held by Japan and by China, which shifts the leverage politically and economically from what was once a U.S. advantage to a tremendous advantage for those countries. There's been an 80% drop in the value of the U.S. dollar. If any of you are still invested in American stocks, you're watching it deteriorate. If any of you, like me, are Americans who hopped on an airplane and went to Europe, mistakenly thinking that you could actually survive there, you realize that your Big Mac is costing you a month's salary in Norway, etc. But the incredible problem that this creates is that the United States once had the capacity to use a great deal of economic leverage vis-a-vis Asia, opening markets, trade negotiations, currency dealings, and the like. That, for the most part, is now gone.
Take a seat.